Okay, so what I want to do is I'm going to take a chalk pastel pencil, and I brought enough for everybody. Chalk pastel pencil can be really handy, but there are drawbacks, so that's why I wanted to show it to you. I just use a kneadable eraser if I need to erase anything, but you'll also notice I have this flat brush too, and that's really important. So if I have my photo, and let's say I'm going to draw, you know, what I see here, the first thing I'm going to point out, you guys, is there is a horizon line because there's the water. Thank you so much, Mindy. How do you draw a straight line across? And if I'm just going to take my wrist and do it, right? Here's the problem with your wrist. Notice what happens with your wrist, right? So you can't rely on your wrist. So think about your shoulder as the fulcrum, you know, don't move your wrist at all. Keep your wrist steady. One way you could do it is just try and go along and just kind of, you know, do your best guess. Notice how my whole arm is rigid. It's just my shoulder that's moving. That gives me a better line right off the get-go. But that still might not be right. So what I tend to do instead is I'll turn my canvas. I can use my finger and just use it as a guide. See my little pinky finger? I hold it there to whatever height I want the pencil to be. Now I'm going to hold my arm steady and just go down. There. That should be a fairly good line right across. All right, now it's just a matter of just kind of roughing in. And I don't want any perfection. I'm going to squint my eyes just to get the big shapes. So I just go in and kind of noodle around. Something along these lines. You know, I can always go back in and erase and make it what I want it to be. But for something like this, where it's not a person, you know, I don't have to be exactly on the money with my drawing. It's just a bunch of rocks. It's really not that big of a deal. But I like to try and get it as right as possible. One of the drawbacks is chalk pastel is pigment that's kind of dry and just barely kind of compressed together. So there's loose powder on here right now. The minute I start painting, that powder becomes part of my paint and it changes the color of the paint. So it actually becomes part of the pigment of the paint. So what I do is I'll draw with the chalk pastel and then I just wipe it. I'm just wiping off all the dust. But notice the drawing is still there. But my brush gets rid of all the loose pigment. So what I want to do now is I've got this drawing done and I want to do the demo in oil, and I'm going to start with just my darkest values. So remember my value sketch again was just 3 values. The top one that I had done, it was just black and grays and whites. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to start laying some of those values in and just make it really simple, almost cartoony. So what I've got is I've got the walnut alkyd right here, and then there's the color right beside it. So I can just add a little bit as I need to. And I push and wiggle that brush in the paint, again, to open up the bristles and really load it with the paint. That alkyd will make the paint flow a little bit more smoothly too. But I'm not adding any oil. Oil would never be added in the beginning, only because it dries so slowly, I wouldn't be able to paint on top of it until days later when it dried. So then what I'll do is I'll take my picture and I'm just gonna look at it. I'm gonna squint my eyes and look for my big darks and just start scrumbling them in. And by scrumbling, I put the brush down and I start rubbing it. And that way, I'm not laying down thick gobs of paint. I'm actually working the paint into the canvas so it's a little thinner. So it's not super thick and goopy. So it's got the fast, dry, medium mixed in, but I'm also using thin layers of paint. And then I go in there and I make sure it's thin so I can wipe it a little bit. Again, push and wiggle my brush if I need to reload. Go back in and push and wiggle into the bristles of the brush and the canvas. Just putting in all of the darks wherever I see them. Until I have all those masses of darks. It's kind of like an abstract painting look right now, right? What I have is all these blacks, and I just did this like a couple hours ago, so it's still wet. Blacks in here, then I started getting to some of the browns of the mid-tones added more brown, less black, still had some fast dry medium in it. Then I started putting in some of the darks in the water as well, because there are some darks. When you look at that picture and you squint your eyes, the reflected shadow on the surface of the water is actually a little bit darker even than the rock themselves. So squint your eyes and look at that photo. And look at, for example, this big rock right down here near the center, and there's a big shadow under it. And squint your eyes and you can see that the shadow is darker. So, you know, I just went in with a brown, and just brown with not even really any sort of blue in it, and just painted that shadow. It's just directly underneath that rock. And then as I went towards the right, where everything's more in shadow, there's a lot of shadow on the right. Notice now the reflections, the shadows are starting to look kind of greenish. So I just added a little bit of yellow and blue to my brown and kind of went greenish on that side. But even if I didn't, even if I just went brown, it would still work. But just start with your values. Don't get caught up too much in color. We'll really go more into color in week 4. But really think more about, you know, what are the values you're seeing? How are you seeing them? You know, with oil, we have the luxury of painting right up to another color and just kind of softening it with your brush. So, you know, you can go in there and say, oh, I kind of messed up. Okay, I'm going to bring that green up into that brown, or I'm going to, you know, make this look a little bit more blurry between these two edges. With acrylic, you don't have that luxury, but what you can do instead is you can dry brush over it like I showed you last week. And at this point, once I've gotten all my darks, and if I'm going to be layering on top of wet oil, I don't use any medium anymore. So I'm not going to use any walnut alkyd. I'm just going to use paint. So now I'll go in there and I'll start looking, okay, where are some of those lighter values? Oops, and I think I need to get lighter. So I'm going to add some more white. And I can just start putting in some of those lighter values. And this is all very wet, you guys. Look at this. I can use my finger to rub it and show you how wet the paint still is. But because it has fast dry medium in it, and because I scrumbled it and made it thin, I can go right beside it and right on top of it without any problem. So it really is a big deal to kind of think about how much paint there is. Think thin layers first, a little bit of walnut oil alkyd or liquid fast dry medium, and then just get thicker as you go along. And now I can literally just go in and start filling in some of these areas with these lighter values. And I'm squinting my eyes as I'm working just to look and see where the big shapes are and what are they doing, because I could get lost in all the detail of those rocks. There's so many nooks and crannies, and that just would kill my soul. Okay. I would keep going that way with the rocks, but I'd also do the same thing with the midtones of the blues and stuff in the water. In some places, the water, when you look at it, again, don't think of it as water. Think of it as just masses of color and shape that you're looking at. Right here in the middle, underneath the left half of the canvas, it's all browns, because the light is just not reflecting off the surface of the water, but bouncing right in through, and you're actually seeing everything on the bottom of the sand right there, and it's brown. On the right, where you see the greens and the blues, now that's the light bouncing off the top of the surface of the water and reflecting the sky above it. So assess what you're seeing, where you're seeing it, what color is it, what value is it, what's happening there. Because if all of this is browns, I'm going to want to take my brown and mix in some white because of the lighter value, but maybe it's warmer. I don't know, maybe it looks more orangey, or maybe it looks more greenish. Whatever you see, kind of think about it. Or is it just brown and white? I think it's a little bit more orangey than that. I'm going to mix in a little bit of red and yellow to see what happens with my brown and my white. That feels better to me. Now, there are some subtleties of value shift in here that I'm not worrying about right now, because I just want to paint it in there. I just want to get the main values in without dealing with all the little rocks. So big shapes, not worrying about details, not worrying about that surf yet or anything, just kind of seeing where the blues are, seeing where some of these values are, painting them in. For the sky, that's where I'd get cleaner. I'd want that sky to be cleaner, so my brush might be too messy for that. If I was only using one brush, I would have to go clean it off before I started my sky. I have another one though. So I'm going to take my sky color, which I'm going to do is some of that ultramarine blue mixed with white. And I'm going to add some of that turquoise, but none of the brown. And the sky is almost always lighter than you think it is. So lighten it up. Push and wiggle that brush in there, because again, still this is a mid-tone. And you can start to paint some of that sky. I'm still scrumbling it, because I'm going to paint some clouds and such on top of it. And I would just continue going through like that, covering up all these areas. See how kind of cartoony it looks right now? It's kind of, you know, indistinct, not a ton of detail yet. So using that process, everything is still nondescript. There's all these blacks just scrumbled in with fast dry medium added, all these darks, painted in some of that kind of sandy color that I saw down there. The sky was that same mix, blue with a little bit of turquoise and white up here. The clouds I kind of made a little bit purpley in the shadows, but I haven't painted any of my lightest lights other than I started some of the surf to get rid of the white of the canvas. And that surf, what I did is I took some tiny, tiny dot of yellow and added it to my white. So it's not white, it's just got a little tiny bit of yellow into it, just to keep it bright so that I can really save any bright solid white for the end if I really want white to shine. Okay, so what I want to do now is just show you how to kind of start to finish this a little bit. I can move to a smaller brush maybe my number 2. And now I could go through my rocks. Okay, so what I want to do now, I did use basically the same colors all throughout here, right? It was just those browns with a little bit of blue with some white for my midtones. But when you look at your rock, really look at it, in places it looks like the rock is almost kind of reddish, and in other places it's kind of grayish, and in some places it might have some, you know, orange in it. You can see there's a variety of different shades of browns in there, and you could leave it just like this and be just fine. Or you could say, you know what, I'm going to add some of those orangey tones in there. So I'm going to take some orange, mix it in with my brown, and just kind of go in and just have a hint of some orangey tones. And all I'm doing is I'm going on top of my painting, and I'm just kind of just mixing it in with some of the colors that are already on there. So I'm not doing anything thick or crazy yet, but I'm just kind of influencing some of the colors that I see in my rocks. Maybe there's a little hint of orange in here. Add some in there. And that just helps give a little bit more interest to the color, because the rocks usually have a lot of different minerals and stuff going on with it. All of my clouds, I used all the same number 4 brush and just kind of did some more of a swirly pattern with my brush work. For my rocks, I tended to just kind of look at the shape that I saw and paint my direction of my stroke in the shape that I saw. And for the water, I mostly just used a horizontal stroke. And that can really make a difference too, because if it's water, it's going to be flat. And it's not usually like, a lot of times I see people painting water, it's like scooped, you know, but it doesn't really look like that very often. So that's our brain telling us we think we know what's going on. Some of these oranges, maybe if you want to paint them into your water, you know, if you want little rocks, well, maybe now you could paint a few of them in. But again, don't paint them all, and don't paint them all the same size. They're not all going to be 1-inch round circles. If anything, they're probably going to be little lines, one big line next to a little line next to a dot, and then, you know, another little line next to a big line next to a dot. Think about variety of shapes and sizes in your brushwork. Okay, so I'm just going to start adding a few highlights to my rocks. So I'm going to take my my brown and my white, almost all white, and just go in. Now the paint might be a little bit thicker. Maybe now it's on your brush a little bit thicker, because now I'm layering on top of possibly 2 layers of paint. So my first layer was thin, scrumbled in. My second layer didn't have any medium and was just painted on top. And now my next layer might be a little bit thicker, and I might just use my brush holding it a little bit more parallel to the canvas, so that I actually am using that brush just to lay down the color. Because the minute I start to paint on top of something dark or next to something dark, I'm going to pick up that color, and I might have to wipe off the brush, get more paint, and then go in again. So you just kind of go in and you squint your eyes. Where do you see the major value shifts? What shape are they making? How are they connected to the objects and shapes around them? Or are they? Maybe they're not. Do they need to be softened on one side? Wipe off your brush or get a clean brush and just kind of wipe it. If it's an acrylic, you can just dry brush right over it. And then once I'm to the point where I want to put in my brightest lights, and I've got everything else in there and there's no white yet, then I can take a clean brush, clean off my brush really well. And that's when you can get thicker with the paint. If you have like just solid white in there, then maybe you actually get really thick and chunky with the paint, and you just lay that sucker in there and then go in and soften it. Wipe off the brush, go around the edges of that thick white and just kind of blur it a little bit around the lines in the direction of the shape that you see. So if my cloud, I see a light up here that's kind of scooped. So I'll lay it down, wipe it, and just kind of gently rub around those edges. But I can't go over this again after. Once I get that bright white really thick in there, I can't mess with it. I've got to just leave it. And if you really need to get even thicker, let's say you had really thick paint and you were working really in impasto, you could use your palette knife. Use the bottom of the palette knife, scoop it up, lay it in there, and get really thick where you need it to be thick. And then use your brush to kind of help soften it up or leave it kind of broken. But it's that layering of thick over thin. The first layers, acrylic and oil, both have to be that way. Any of those big thick chunk areas of white, and even in some of these areas where the surf is hitting. If you have any surf, like I have all this white in here is actually white with just a tiny bit of yellow, very tiny bit of yellow. That can be hard to do, you know, to just get that right mix. But let's say I just have a very small area of surf breaking, like maybe even just right in here. My palette knife might be wider than that area. So what I'll do is I'll just clean up my palette knife and just go and get only just a partial line of white, just on as wide of an area as I need. And then I would just go in there and lay it down. We would just flick it upward a little bit. Wipe it off, add some more. Go in and lay in some lines if I see them as horizontals. Wherever I see it, it's just a tool, whether you use a palette knife or a brush, to try and apply the paint. And the key is with that palette knife to try and help you get it a little thicker. And then you can soften it softly, gently, brushing around the edges as needed. So if you want to crackle, practice holding that palette knife right above that canvas, parallel with it, and just barely kiss it. And that can help give you that crackle.